This is Keys to the Shop, episode 168, Getting the Best from Your Coffee with Pete Licata. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFurio. I'm your host for the show. Thanks for stopping by. This is going to be a great conversation. Of course, we're talking to none other than Pete Licata, World Barista Champion 2013, and the author of this new book, How to Get the Best from Your Coffee. And we're going to dive into the book. We're going to dive into these ideas and Pete's philosophy on brewing and coffee. It's going to be a really fantastic conversation. Now, this episode is brought to you by truly one of the world's best equipment suppliers for specialty coffee, and that's none other than Prima Coffee over at prima-coffee.com. Prima Coffee curates the best equipment from around the world in order to fit it perfectly with the needs of their customers. You know, we're not just talking about home equipment, we're talking about commercial equipment too. Everything from espresso machines, grinders, under-counter refrigeration, big or small. If your coffee shop uses it, Prima Coffee has it. They're wonderful people. I've known them since the beginning of their company. Helping you be successful in brewing great coffee is what drives them. When you go to their website, prima-coffee.com, you're going to see what I mean, because not only do they have an extensive variety of equipment to choose from that will fit any need that you have, but they also have a lot of free resources for you to read or watch to help you learn how to use that equipment more effectively. So very much a generous group of people and experts at helping you get the right gear to fit whatever situation you happen to be in. So go to prima-coffee.com. If you have equipment needs for your shop, that is the place to go. Let them know that Keys to the Shop sent you. And thank you so much, Prima, for your support of Keys to the Shop. Now, this episode is also brought to you by the Pacific Barista series. This is a line of plant-based performance beverages that are designed specifically for the professional barista and the standards that we all know professional baristas have for what they serve their guests. They want excellence in what they serve, and the Barista series delivers just that. When you're using their oat, soy, coconut, rice, or almond milk on bar, you're going to get really amazing latte art ready texture. It's something that can take the heat from steaming, and the flavor of the product doesn't overwhelm the beverage. It helps the coffee shine through, which is really important. This makes it a perfect choice for your cafe's menu, in my opinion. So I would say to find out more information, go to the website, pacificfoods.com, and get the Barista series in your shop. Try it out for yourself and see how it can elevate the non-dairy offerings in your shop. And a huge thanks to Pacific for their support of this show. All right, so today we're sitting down with a world champion who has written a book on coffee. Now, of course, you're going to want to get this book. You don't become a world champion because you don't know something about coffee. And this happens to be somebody who knows a lot about coffee. And the context for this is it's really timely, because in specialty coffee, we have so many different types of coffees from so many different types of farms. It's just breathtaking. Just in one roastery, you're going to go through so many different lots and origins, and it's dizzying to be able to try to get the most out of all these different types of coffees. One roastery, let alone many, is a daunting task. And it would be great to have a robust, tried and true methodology that would let you start off your brewing process with these coffees on the right foot and help you get ahead and get to that sweet spot sooner. Because we all know that when you brew coffee, you dial it in for so long, and then sometimes you don't have very much left after you really get it to taste amazing. And that's where today's guest, Pete Licata, has really delivered the goods in this new book. Pete is a returning guest to Keys to the Shop, and he talked with us way, way back in 2017 on episode 3, all about the role of mentorship in specialty coffee. He's kind of coming back to mentor us with this book and talk to us about the brewing process and what he's discovered about it. Now, if you're not familiar with Pete Licata, Pete has been in coffee since 2003 when he started as a barista in Kansas City. And he quickly got into competition, and from there has become basically one of the most accomplished coffee professionals and competitors in the world. In 2005, he won his regional and placed 10th in the U.S. Championships. He then went on to compete for 6 more seasons, winning 4 more regionals, 2 U.S. Championships, and finally he accomplished his ultimate goal of becoming the World Barista Champion in 2013. Since winning, he has spent a lot of time exploring ways to achieve greater coffee quality, whether on the coffee farm or as a roaster or in preparation. During his championship year, he formed Licata Coffee Consultants, which is a company whose consultants are dedicated to working hard at helping people realize their coffee dreams. After winning the WBC title, the Licata Coffee Consultants team worked to coach and advise competitors, including national champions from Australia, China, Russia, the U.S., as well as Hidenori Izaki, the winner of the 2014 World Barista Championships. The company mentors a number of barista competitors, but has developed their services to include retail, wholesale training, and quality control development for producers of specialty coffee all along the chain of production. Pete himself has advised coffee companies in roasting, selection, quality control over the years. He's also consulted on cafe layout, new coffee equipment, ready-to-drink coffee products, non-dairy beverages, and other coffee products. Pete is a Barista Guild of America certified lead instructor, a World Barista certified sensory judge, and of course he is also the author of this new book, How to Get the Best from Your Coffee, which we'll be discussing with him today. This book is aimed at being a practical guide to the next generation of coffee professionals, and we're going to get to sit down with Pete and talk about some of these compelling ideas and principles that are outlined in the book. Some of them are just really fascinating, and we're talking about choosing the temperature of your pour-over coffee based on the density of your coffee. He gives a simple equation for that in the book. We talk about coffee filters, the shape of your brewer. We talk about grind particle distribution and several other things that are going to give you a leg up in getting the best from your coffee early in the process of dialing that coffee in, which we all, I think, need that. And I'm really glad that Pete has come through with this book. So, without further ado from me, let's get right to this conversation discussing this great new book with the 2013 World Barista Champion and my friend Pete Licata. Pete Licata, welcome back to Keys to the Shop.
Thank you. Good to be back.
It's been quite some time. We were chatting earlier before recording, and you mentioned that your daughter is about the same age as this podcast.
That is about right. Yeah, she was born on Christmas Day in 2016. So, yeah, probably similar time when you started doing this.
Yeah, it kind of was joking and kind of feels similar to having a child to have a podcast, but nothing like it at the same time.
Oh, there's slight variances, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, a lot's happened since the last time we had you on the show. And now, for instance, you're living in Melbourne.
Yes.
What are you doing in Melbourne right now?
So I am working for the Nomad Coffee Group, which is kind of the parent company of Veneziano Coffee Roasters, who are a company that I've consulted with for the last several years, worked with their barista competitors here in Australia, and just kind of known them for quite a while and just always had a really great time with. We had some discussions, and they offered me a position down here. The position is technically research and development coffee consultant, which is a long way of saying make everything better. And, so yeah, I touch a little bit on QC. I touch a little bit on systems, a little bit on roast, a little bit on the cafe. I'm essentially a linchpin to help all of the managers and the structure of the companies grow and succeed even better than they already have in the past.
Oh, incredible! Make things better. Yeah. That's pretty cool.
That's actually what I wanted to call a book that, but it started getting taken, so I decided to move on.
Well, yeah, I mean, but the book you ended up with, the title of your book is still, basically the same thing, and that's the other thing that's changed is now you're an author of a book, How to Get the Best from Your Coffee.
That's right. It's crazy to think about.
Congrats.
Thank you.
This is quite a handy book, and yeah, I love the way it's laid out. It's a good guidebook, but it's also prescriptive in terms of, like, when you open it up, you get the recipes to make successful coffee right away, and then you launch into some great detail about the why behind the what and the how to.
Yes.
And going through this over the past several days, it's just been very intuitive and refreshingly simple to just absorb into my mind. It's already crammed full of a bunch of other stuff. And so I'm sure that a lot of other people feel the same way. So really well done. And I guess the question is, how long has this been kind of stewing in your mind? Like, what was the catalyst for this? So what is the problem you're trying to solve with this book?
So interestingly, I've been working on this for almost 2 years now. It kind of initially came up in my head. I've been talking to people about, in particular, filter brewing, but obviously various different things over the years, working as a consultant. And I've been finding that either the resources that we have at hand are a little bit opaque in their usefulness, or they sort of complicate something without giving a direct solution to it, or like a kind of the usefulness of what's being talked about. And so I figured, like I could make a little short book that could be useful for people, maybe help them brew coffee better. So I had that in mind for a long time, but it really got started, I would say, when I started taking density measurements of whole bean roasted coffee and applying those to temperature application in a brew. When I started doing that, I started to see some real results, but I also started to kind of sort of think about how we approach coffee a little bit differently, and started realizing that we don't really have very concise ways of accounting for what we do in certain elements of the brewing process.
The first thing that we see in the book, in the recipe, one of the first things that's probably the most fascinating thing is this density measurement chart.
Yeah.
And this is something I've never seen before, and I want to know where this come from. Why did you start doing this?
Well, for a little, just a brief backstory. When I started getting into this book, I started getting very, very logical and trying to be very science-based in applying things like water temperature, heat, energy, whether it be thermal energy or kinetic energy, all those types of elements in our brewing process. I started trying to apply those to brewing coffee. And on paper, which I think a lot of people are doing this now, but on paper they make tons of sense. Hey, if I increase this energy and I decrease this energy, I'll get a similar result, or a more equivalent extraction, or whatever that might be. But the reality is that when practice, it doesn't really work that way. And I think that anybody who's been in the coffee industry for long enough realizes that every coffee behaves pretty differently, and there's not one singular right way to make coffee. And so when I got looking at, I started thinking about how are these coffees different in particular. So I got a whole bunch of samples. I got tons of samples from roasters from around the world, around the USA. I roasted some of my own coffee. I took it and I started looking at how do we account for some of the variances or the differences, especially in the way that it accounts, or it equates to what type of water temperature we should be using to brew our coffee in the first place. And by doing that, I look, looking at Agtron colors and looking at bean sizes, or even bean counts, like, hey, how many beans are in this 100-gram dose? And nothing really added up. Nothing was consistent in any way whatsoever. And then I started thinking about density in that sense of, when we know, if you light roast something or something's very high grown, it tends to be more dense and compact. It tends to have more acid content. And those coffees tend to need more more energy, more high temperature to extract properly. And then on the other hand, which I think a lot of people aren't experiencing this because they're not really willing to give a dark roast of coffee a try these days. But if you have a very dark roast or a really light, low density coffee that's low grown or et cetera, it tends to not have much organic acid content or availability, and it tends to need a little bit of a lower temperature to extract at its best. You don't want a high temperature because you tend to get these really dry, bitter, astringent type flavors from those dry distillates. So then I started putting that all together to say, if we can measure that density and equate that to what temperature is more appropriate, I wonder if there's a trend. And I would say one of the things that I wish I had tabulated more and put into the book was those making some trend lines of how that actually works. Once again, the ideal temperature is a little bit subjective for a lot of people, and there's more than one way to get to a reasonable result with coffee. But I did find that by measuring that density and equating that to a specific temperature setting is a really good place to start. It's actually a really great indicator of where your temperature, like a really tight range of where your temperature should be.
When you're looking at this, is this something that you've just tested with pour-over coffees, filter coffees, or is this something that also applies to espresso?
I've really tested it much more extensively with filter coffees. And once, especially pour-overs, that was been one of my biggest testing methods, just because I wasn't doing a lot of batch brews with a machine that could change temperature readily. But what that ultimately led to was, where are we measuring the temperature of our coffee? And so I have specifically in the book, I have saying this is a great temperature to set for your kettle set temperature. It's not the slurry temperature in particular, because the slurry temperature is almost always, 5 to 10 degrees cooler in Fahrenheit temperature. And that's because water, dropping through the air loses temperature as it moves through a system, as it, some of the heat gets absorbed by, say, ceramic or a different material, or even just, the equalization temperature of the coffee grinds and the water itself. It tends to lower that slurry temperature. And so I think one of the things that we've been missing is what's the coffee water temperature of espresso versus what's the coffee water temperature of, say, a pour over or a batch brew.
Right.
So I've done a lot more extensive testing on filter and pour over. I've done a little bit of testing on espresso so far. It does have a really strong correlation, but I think that it's a little bit more, a little bit less flexible with espresso. I think because the temperature in the espresso basket is a little bit higher to begin with.
Oh, interesting.
A little more temperamental. Yeah.
What I think is interesting about this book is that it is a blend of scientific rigor and measurements, while at the same time the decision for what you've arrived at for your brew recipe for the book, your ideal brew recipe, is not necessarily, it's not just those things, it's what tastes the best. And speak a little bit about that, because this is never something that we should stop talking about, and how our palates are quite adept scientific instruments, and we kind of outsource it to instruments now that maybe atrophies the way that we use our palate.
Yeah. Well, I came from the background a long time ago, as I'm sure you did as well, where we taste everything because, taste is the king. And, there's been a lot of adaptation of, especially refractometers for use in coffee extraction. And a lot of people are either forgoing completely the tasting process, or they are allowing, numbers to dictate what is correct, as opposed to the senses, of their tongue and what they taste. I find it a really interesting topic because I believe in the ability to, you know, recreate or track variables scientifically. Obviously, I did a lot of that in a certain way in the book. But at the same time, you know, our palates are actually quite sensitive, more sensitive than maybe certain people want to admit. Or on the other side of that coin, sometimes too sensitive. If you have a cold, or if you, you know, we have discussions of with age, you know, bitterness becomes diminished, our perception of bitterness, and so we enjoy things that are bitter more than when we're young. You know, having a 2-year-old daughter is a great example of that. She's very sensitive to bitterness in certain ways. But the interesting thing to me, and the thing that I think is missing, is the fact that, for one, if we're talking about bitterness, there are many different types of bitterness, which I think has been disavowed by a number of people at different points. But in the culinary world, it's very readily understood that there are many different types of bitterness that we experience. And some are very pleasant, and some are very off-putting, and some are learned preferences. And so, you know, we can't discount that. And then secondly, in terms of extraction and measurement, I think that we are actually very far off from fully measuring on a readily accessible basis all of the compounds that make up what is actually tasty in coffee. You know, the use of a refractometer is a, you know, satellite view without, you know, government level magnification, satellite view of what coffee is. You know, it's like looking down from the moon and saying, hey, there's North America, I can see my house. You know, we don't see that much in a refractometer reading. We see how much, but we don't see what. And I think that's the problem. I think and obviously in robust, scientific lab settings, we do have the ability to start to, you know, pick apart what those compounds are that are in there. And I think at some point we'll get to what kind of constitutes what everybody finds to be great tasting coffee, or more people to find a great tasting coffee. But we don't have a way to track that in the coffee industry, in a cafe setting or anything like that.
Right. So the role of instruments in measurement in coffee, as it sounds like it should be in support of your palate, and I imagine that so many of the people that may overcorrect to the side of using instruments might just do so for the reason that palates are subjective, and we have an industry that has so many people going in and out, and that various skill levels can taste or cannot taste certain things. So if you want to have consistency, I imagine you should be weighing things and measuring things, just as a roaster would do the same thing for, you know, achieving a pretty uniform roast of a coffee every time. But in this book, you know, your workflow for creating these judgments about what's best, I wonder, what would you recommend, based on what your experience is, for us to do, like to be able to fold in instruments in a responsible way while also training our palates to not give up too much to measurement through outside sources?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a couple of things you have to consider. You know, the palate is the easiest because you can always take a sip of coffee and you can always taste something relatively easily in any given environment, although you do have things like palate fatigue over time. But in general, though, you know, we need to keep doing the things that we do, which is palate development exercises, things where we understand, you know, the nature of, say, organic acids, like the Q exams, or even just tasting multiple things, you know, tasting that good old exercise we started doing years and years ago of saying, hey, I've got 17 different varieties of apples, you know, let's taste them. Let's write down the differences and think about what's happening, and maybe do some research and understand what exactly, you know, why this one tastes different than that one. You know, like this one has a higher concentration of malic acid, or this one has elements of, you know, phosphorus, or it has, you know, whatever else in it. And that's why it starts to taste different to us. So we need to do that because we need to, as, you know, professionally speaking, we need to understand what it is that is interacting with our tongues. And then if you are wanting to utilize a tool like a refractometer, you need to do more than just look at the TDS percentage, because the TDS percentage is, in my opinion, one of the least useful numbers that we can glean. So if we are looking at TDS percentage, there's a lot of ways to get there. And ultimately, that number only tells us so much about the coffee. And if you have something like the extraction percentage yield of that brew, it gives us a much better understanding of, the amount of solubles we got out of that coffee, or more of what's in the cup. And I think what this equates to, using multiple data points, and in this case, using multiple data points of instrumentation as well as your palate, is creating a better picture of understanding and a better idea of the nature of the coffee and how you want it to taste. And I think that's getting back to my point about maybe we can't really see all of the things that we're extracting into the cup. Anytime we have more data points, we have more things that we can account for, we can recreate what is in there more readily. Just like with roasting, if you have if you have 4 different temperatures, you have your exhaust temperature, and you have your ambient air temperature, and you have your bean probe temperature, and you have your some other temperature. You're tracking more, and if you're able to make those more consistent, then you can create a better result more often, essentially.
Excellent. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's a trail to help of breadcrumbs to help you get back to that point if you wanted to. And I would love to dive into the book just a little bit here and talk about some of these explanations about your brew recipe, which you give right in the beginning of the book. Then there are 4 brew fundamentals that make up the recipe, essentially. You've got water as the first, device and filter, grinding, and then variables.
Right.
Of course, within each one is an entire world, maybe a podcast within each one. But we've been hearing a lot about water lately. What is the focus of this particular section of the book that you really want to hammer home to people when it comes to dialing in or their coffee to get the best from their coffee?
With water in particular, that fundamental is broken down into 2 things, which is the water chemistry and the water temperature. And I really want people to understand the importance of water in, the makeup of our coffee and how it interacts with what is happening. And that's the reason I started with water in particular, not only because in a workflow, you set your water temperature if you're going to change that first, and you make sure that you have your water, because that takes time to get up to temperature or to manipulate. But ultimately, I wanted to really stress the importance of what it is, so that people can have a better understanding. And I do, in fact, point to the Water for Coffee book by Maxwell Dash with Chris Hendon. I did get a little bit of quotes from Maxwell on the water's interaction with your coffee grinds, and got to use a little bit of that in the book. And I really just wanted to say, for one, it's really important, but for 2, most of the time we only have so much control over it in a cafe environment. And I have there's even a little kind of breakout box thing that's talking about, when you make your own water for brewing, in a cafe, there's not a lot of ways that you can actively manipulate or change your water chemistry. So the value of knowledge of water chemistry only goes so far in the application stage, So if you have a problem with your brewing and I say, hey, it sounds like you have too much calcium in your water, the only thing that you can do is try to find another filter or a way to remove some of that calcium from the water, and potentially, in that sense of using reverse osmosis and remineralizing. but you can't just say like, oh, I'll just pull down the calcium by 50 parts per million in my water. Like there's just no way to do that right now. And maybe there will be systems like that in the future, but I bet they'll cost a fortune.
Mm-hmm.
It's if you have a remineralization system that could be tweaked, there might be ways to do that, like I say, but it's a very, very advanced, very hands-on, very particular thing. So super important to know, and great stuff if you want to dig into, say, Brewers Cup presentations or things like that. Application in the real world only kind of goes so far as what we can do with it.
How do we go about applying some of this to our situation? I mean, you mentioned remineralization systems and their impact on water quality. What are some other things that we can do to take action based on your experience?
Well, based on my experience, and I'm obviously, I'm far from the expert on water by itself, but, you basically have two major options. You have the option of enough filtration that it takes anything bad out of the water but leaves enough good in it, or you have the option of remove everything out you can and add back in to make a good water chemistry. Obviously, the easiest of those is to simply remove enough, which in Kansas City, you give that example in the book, I believe, which is in Kansas City we have pretty hard water, but has plenty of calcium and magnesium in it. So if you use kind of those charcoal filters, sediment filters, and different levels of kind of micron-sized filters to pull out enough of that stuff, you can get a good result. Generally, the TDS is just a little bit high, which is why a lot of people still use reverse osmosis. Interestingly, here in Melbourne, the water, I believe, on average, the waters have TDS and mineral content coming from the tap is actually quite low. And so, you can definitely taste a little bit of like chloramine or something to put in to clean the water. If you remove all that stuff, you just end up with a low TDS water that's not going to perhaps extract as much as you want. And so, even here in our cafe here, we have remineralization that adds magnesium into the water.
So let's say we have decent water. Of course, we talked about the temperature correlation to the density of the coffee already. You break that down a little bit more in this same section, because temperature of your water is a factor in the extraction of coffee. And I think people would be surprised at how hot or how cool they could get their coffee depending on the type of coffee it is.
Yes. And the reason that this is, once again, water is our number one fundamental is, obviously chemistry has a massive impact on how coffee extracts and what we get in the cup, but the temperature of the water is actually really underestimated in its power with coffee extraction. I find that just manipulating the water temperature will have some of the most noticeable variations in your coffee flavor. And I get into that in the book, but basically it kind of correlates to what do you want to get out of the coffee. People used to say you can't really extract coffee. If you have coffee or water that's 190 degrees Fahrenheit, you're not going to extract anything out of your coffee. And that's just simply not true. We know that because you can do a cold water drip system that extracts plenty of strength and plenty out of that coffee. It's just different compounds. It's different form of the coffee. A lot of the caramelization and what are they called, melanoidins, I believe, of the coffee come out without the organic acid content or some of the more bitter distillates and things like that coming out of that as well. So you can get plenty of extraction no matter what the temperature of the water is. But even a couple of degrees Fahrenheit will, change the nature of your coffee, not just what you get out of it in terms of balancing the cup, but then, getting beyond the extraction that you really want. And so I found, and I have one of those, I did a number of tests with water and just the temperature of that water to say how much is being extracted from this coffee just because the water temperature has changed.
And those were the experiences that you had to create this chart.
Yes. And I think it's funny and interesting to point out. I did hundreds of individual brews for this book. I actually, took and brewed over and over and over and over and over again and measured TDS extraction, everything else, for the point of specific brewing variable changes and their impacts on the final cup. So I definitely measured, and then I also had to taste and write down a lot of notes about what's happening in the differences between these things on average. So yes, a lot of work that went into that.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, even if I look at the TDS percentage and the extraction yield just from changing the water temperature, we went, and I think that I've seen some other people do very similar experiments with temperature of brewing, and it just reinforces it. But you have almost an entire percentage of extraction yield change from simply changing the water temperature, 13 degrees Fahrenheit total from 194 Fahrenheit to 207 Fahrenheit.
Wow.
And it's pretty interesting. And there's definitely a good trend line that proves that you get more out of the coffee the higher the temperature is. And the question is really just becomes how much more do you want? I don't think it's always, I've heard some people say that you want as much as you can possibly get out of the coffee, which I don't really agree with because there's plenty that we don't really want to taste in our coffee.
as much as your palate can take.
Yeah. What's your preference? And more importantly, what is your customer's preference? I think is probably the bigger question.
So in the book, we move on to the section on device and filters. You and I know that so many coffee shops just have what they have, and they have it forever in terms of a pour-over setup. If somebody starts out with, like, say, B60s or a B-house dripper or something, until those things break, they usually are there year after year after year, and everything revolves around those. We don't really think a whole lot after the first purchase, but what we read in this chapter is that the device material and the structure of it is so critical to what you can get from the coffee, and then you also go into the porosity and the thickness of the filters, and this is really getting detailed. I wonder if you could just pull some things out of this chapter that you think are the highlights that are most applicable to maybe a commercial coffee setting, for example, to be aware of.
Well, I think I kind of give a little bit of a summary of this chapter. This was one of my favorites because it's something that I've been focused on for a long time. But, I think I also touch on shape of the dripper as well in here. But I feel that the material of the device and the filter that is used in the device is far more impactful than the shape of the device. As long as they have holes in the bottom and you're pouring water actively from the top, there is a similarity in the way they're going to behave. There are obviously some slight differences, but we can talk about that later, or you can read it in the book. But so the material of the device in particular, I have always had amazing flavor experiences with ceramic drippers, whether they be B-house or B60 or Kalita or whatever it is. I've always had not so amazing experiences. Not that I've never had a great experience, but not nearly as common as ceramic with, say, metal or plastic drippers. I have had very good tasting coffees from all different types, but on average, I would say 9 times out of 10, it's the ceramic tastes better to me. And so I always wondered why that was. And I got into, I just tested them. I took a V60 metal, plastic, and ceramic next to each other and just brewed over and over and took the extractions and tasted them. And sure enough, the ceramic one tasted the best to me. And, but then I started looking at the numbers, and there's always been a lot of talk about ceramic drippers suck the heat out of the brew. And so ceramic is a bad material because it is detrimental to the brew slurry. The problem is that in my numbers, I always, and I mean always, got higher extraction yields and TDS from the ceramic dripper than I did from the plastic or from the metal. And so then my numbers started to correlate with why I probably liked the flavor experience of those ceramic drippers better. Needless to say, once again, as you pointed out, a lot of times in the cafe, we have what we have, and if someone bought plastic drippers, those aren't going to break anytime soon,
Right.
So the real value of that is to say, understanding the nature of what's happening with that device so that you can adjust, why you would adjust in order to get, say, by nature, I'm getting a little bit less extraction from that plastic dripper. So I probably need to raise my brew temperature a little bit or grind a little bit finer to get a little bit more out of my coffee into the cup. Not a perfect result in my opinion, because I feel like, why wouldn't you just change to ceramic? Well, being a business owner, I understand that if you need to change out your drippers on a whim, it's not the cheapest investment, and at some point it becomes a little bit too costly for certain people, especially for a lot of cafes. So to be able to understand the nature of what's happening and how to just move yourself in a better direction with what you have is really an important thing as well. And that's something that I'll probably be doing some blog posts and some things to supplement the information in this book as much as I can, just to start keep those conversations going and talk about what's happening. So that's brew material. I think that it's really interesting and is massively impactful to the coffee extraction in particular, the flavor that comes out. We also have the filter, and the filter is something that really was eye-opening once I got into it. I tested different filters, cut them all to AeroPress size, and just pushed the coffee through them. And the amount of solids that came through with the exact same other variables was enormously different. And that really led me to want to get some magnified photos and really dig into what are the differences in these filters, other than some of them being thicker than others. We know that. You can feel that. What's the nature? Why does this one taste better and this one taste worse and this one tastes more clean or more clear, or, the body on this one is better, some things like that. So I really had to dig into, thinking about different size particles that come from a brew, how they permeate the paper, how do the fibers swell up, perhaps? There's a lot of conversations that are in here. I think there's a lot more to explore on paper filters, but what I have in here is pretty detailed and gives a better understanding of the nature of paper filters. If anybody assumes that all paper filters behave relatively the same, they are extremely wrong. So, yeah.
One of the things I love about this book, since reading it, was the idea that there are so many questions it stirs up in the mind of the reader, because there are so many things that we have adopted as truths about what we do, just because we have to, we have to work, we have to make coffee. We can't just wait until we have the perfect information. We got to work with what we have. And I love that you're going to be following up some of this with blog posts to sort of answer some of those questions. But the practice of stirring up the mind of the individual to question different implements and different methodologies is so critical, because we do have a tendency to just focus on what we have and say, we're not going to change it because this is the best out there, because I learned that at a class once, that this is the best out there. And so I'm not going to change it. And I would bet that you would be willing to be wrong if somebody proved you wrong, like just from their own experiments.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there were plenty of times I was wrong, and I proved myself wrong from the experiments that I did in the book. And I think that's the nature of true discovery is, for one, being willing to be willing to say I was wrong about that, but also, I think being of a questioning mindset and really being critical thinking of, hey, this person says that, but I don't taste that. And that's not what works for me. Why does this not work the way that somebody says?
Mm-hmm.
And there are some louder voices in the industry that I think people just kind of pay attention to and accept because, either nobody's thinking critically or nobody's willing to step up and say, hey, I've had a different experience. And I think in this industry in particular, it's very important for people to be vocal and say, no, I've had a different experience, and this is what I've experienced, because, and this is my rigor behind my what I know. And I think the important thing here is to say we can all have opinions. We can all say I like this or I don't like this or I've had different experiences, but to say this is why I believe this thing. That's the importance, and doing some repetitions, doing some comparative tests, doing things like that say, like, whenever I've done this, it turned out better than this, and this is how I've translated that data. And this is my idea of why this is a better way of doing this in this manner.
Mm-hmm.
I think that on a professional level, more baristas need to be willing to really just, think critically and challenge the status quo, because that's the only way that really we grow. We've actually gotten into a bit of a rut lately because everybody's listening to one or two people, and that's not what we should be doing. That was never the way that coffee was when I got into it. Everybody was challenging everybody, and everybody was forging their own path. And now it's a little less like that. So, yeah.
Back in the days of the coffee forums is what I was thinking about.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Those archives are probably still around if anyone wanted to look up coffeed.com.
I think it is actually.
Yeah. Like that type of atmosphere of fascination. So it has, I think, been replaced a little bit with a quest for the answer, and also the elevation of the individual as the fount of knowledge, and like, who is our chosen one to show us the way. And it's somewhat of a conundrum, because here you are writing a book, and I have a podcast, and it's something that I'm glad that you're talking about here, and something that I've talked about on the show is, like, all the people around you in your shop right now probably have a lot of really valuable experiences, and their stories are just as fascinating as the story you might hear about somebody on this show. So the wealth of knowledge and resourcefulness and ingenuity isn't just wrapped up in a books or a podcast or a YouTube channel or something like that. It's literally everywhere.
Yeah. On that note, just real quickly, I think personally that there's a little bit too much value in coffee celebrityism, and which is maybe weird for a lot of people coming from me as a world barista champion, whatever. But I think that people need to really forge their own paths and find their own voice, because that's where the power and the growth on a personal and professional level really is to be able to state your point of view and have logic and clarity behind what you're saying, and people should be willing and courageous to do that, because that's what shows somebody, that's what shows the world that you are a great coffee professional.
That's kind of how you got where you are today, Pete.
Yeah. I mean, I did the same things, and I would recommend that to anybody who wants to forge their own path and get to the top levels of the coffee world, if you will.
Well, kind of going along with that, we've been talking for a bit here, and we're coming to the end of our conversation, honestly, in terms of time. But, I did want to talk about one other factor in the book. And, of course, if you all want to know more about the details of everything that's in this book, you got to go buy the book, read it. But this one in particular is in the spirit of experimentation and sort of making your own path and saying, look, this is what I taste, this is what I prefer. And this was the grind size and grind particle uniformity section of the book, and talking about grinder comparisons and the importance of the array of different particle sizes that different grinders produce. Today, we value uniformity, and that's something that you address in this book in a unique way. I wonder if you can elaborate on some things that are in this chapter that are really maybe challenging to some people.
Yeah, so the grinding chapter, I find, is probably going to be the most polarizing chapter of the book for people who have gone through other educational things or read other people's work or even listened to other people speak. In there, I look at two grinders in particular, and I look at the Guatemala Lab grinder, which is an old grinder we've used for a long time, obviously, and obviously the EK43, which has become very much the standard for most people's grinding needs. And you'll see I have a kind of a grind particle size breakdown in there, which is rough. It's not like the grind charts that you see on a lot of these that a lot of people post. It's not really smooth. It doesn't have 20 different points of grind particle sizes. I have the grind particles grouped into kind of ranges. Under 300 unit microns being the kind of ultra fines, if you will, for filter brewing, and then 300, 500, 500, 800, 800 to 1,000, and so on, even up to like 1,400 microns, which by most definitions is a boulder. And I would say we're not really getting into the boulder range very much on these grinders, but the chart that I have shows really massively different grind particle distributions. And the interesting thing to me is that if you go by the idea that uniformity is the best way and the most efficient way to extract your coffee, I don't believe that you're wrong. I believe that it's true. If you have a more uniform particle size, you generally will extract coffee. A uniform size that's smaller will extract more quickly than a varied size that has more particles in a larger range. I think we should know that because smaller particles extract more quickly. And I think that's pretty well understood in the industry. But the interesting thing to me in testing these things and then brewing and then tasting coffee from these grinders, is that with the grind range that you see from this Guatemala Lab grinder that I use, you wouldn't think that would even make a remotely high extraction at all. But it does. It actually makes, I was hitting 20.5 and even, certain samples that I had, it was easy to hit 21, 22% extraction on. But if you look at this, there's what people, anything over, some people might call over 800 or 1,000 microns to be boulders, and there were plenty in that range. That shouldn't extract well enough to make a balanced cup, and it shouldn't extract even enough coffee into the cup to be measured in a high level like that. But it was actually very comparable to the EK43, which was clearly very uniform in its sizing. And that is fascinating in by itself. But the point behind understanding and seeing those ranges is that there are many different compounds, and those compounds are being extracted at various different rates, and they equate to different things in the cup. And from my experience, and I talk about this, is that I say, hey, I really like the flavor that comes off the Guatemala Lab. I find it to be sweeter. I find it to have more body. I find it to be more depth. It doesn't have as much acid. It doesn't have as much clarity of flavor. It doesn't have a lot of these other things. So, what I come to in the book is really saying there are different types of coffee that you would be making with different types of grinders. And there are many different grinders beyond the two that I tested in the book. But the grind particle distribution and the range of those particle sizes gives you an idea of the nature of those grinders, and it also gives you an idea of the nature of what they're going to tend to produce in the cup that we're going to taste. And so I found that very fascinating. And I've actually found some other grinders that are a bit more modern and, infinite in their grind size adjustment that can create a very, very equivalent, grind particle distribution to the Guatemala lab. There are other grinders out there that make a similar, kind of curve to the EK43. Those are not the only two grinders, and the EK43 is definitely not the only grinder that's out there. And so, one of the things that I've found lately is that everybody is prescribing to a singular grinder. And if you think back to, even 5-10 years ago in this competition, I guess 10 years ago, everybody was using Roberts because it made, everybody loved the flavor of the shots. Everybody said that it was superior. The flat burrs were, not right. They didn't do something well. They, whatever else. They were too acidic, whatever. I think that people found great coffee on either one of those. But lately, the point that I'm trying to get to is that we've really gone down a singular path, and we've lost that variation, and we've lost that willingness to say like, oh, I really love this grinder for the way that it makes this type of coffee, and I love this kind of grinder for the way that it makes this type of coffee, or just I prefer this type of grinder, as opposed to saying this is the only grinder out there that works. And it's not actually the case, and there's a lot of range. So yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting chapter in the book. It's like I say, it's definitely polarizing, I'm sure, for some people. But I really want it to push people and say, you're tasting something, and you're not wrong for tasting that. It's a more of a matter of what do you want to execute? What do you want to make in your cafe? What do you want to serve? What do you want to drink? That is, behind all of those things. And we need to be a little bit less static in our, acceptance of any sort of piece of machinery. We need to be more flexible, more understanding, and more even just exploratory with those things to find the best results.
Love it. So in the spirit of your answer, I think this is kind of going to answer the question I'm about to ask, which is, as we read this book and work to sort of apply it to our own coffees in our shops or at home, what is the mindset that you want people to have, and what are some of the first steps that you would recommend people take after they're done, after they close the book, they go over to their counter? What are the first things that you think they should do, and what's the mindset that they should have as they do it?
I would say that the first thing that I want people to think and have go through their head after they've read that book is that there's so much more to explore in coffee and in extraction in particular, the way that we approach coffee. I think it's more of a mindset of adaptability, I guess I would say. Every coffee is different. We know that. We say it all the time. But what does it mean? How do I apply, specific things and specific elements of what I do with that coffee to get the best result? And just in general, having a bit more of a robust point of view in the approach that we take. A lot of times we say, I'm just going to change the grind size, or I'm just going to change my water temperature, or I'm just going to change some turbulence, or I'm going to do one little thing, and doing one thing at a time is always really good. But a lot of times we pigeonhole, or we rabbit hole, I guess I should say. We rabbit hole down a singular path, as opposed to being open to say like, well, the turbulence I don't think is actually the problem. I think it's actually this vapor filter is has an issue, and maybe this is a better solution to find, or problem to find the solution to, than this other thing that I've been focused on.
Pete, thank you so much for taking time to kind of break down some of these things in the book. Thanks for writing the book. I think it's really great. And certainly the rigor that you've put into producing the results here is going to make a huge difference. And I can't wait to see what it does for people who apply it in their shops and in their homes. How can we get the book? Where do we go to be in contact with you and purchase this book?
Well, right now it is available as an ebook on my website, which is licatacoffeeconsultants.com. It is in EPUB format, which I believe is very common. I'm working on printed versions over the next few months, but they're just a little bit off because I'm also self-publishing, so I have to look at ISBNs and barcodes and formats for printers and all these things that I never considered before. So the printed books are coming. Working on how they will get distributed in the U.S. and around the world. But the absolute easiest way that you can access this is to download it from my website. And it's available for $20 US, which I think is actually pretty reasonable for a pretty robust amount of information. So
yeah, leaves you enough money to buy a ceramic.
That's right.
Pete, thank you so much again. Super great to have you back on the show, my friend.
Yeah, good to be back and good to talk to you. Hope everybody finds use in the book. And, if I see you around at a trade show, whether you are Cristoferio or anybody listening to this podcast, feel free to say hi. I'm always happy to chat.
Well, this whole conversation was just chock full of amazing insights into the brewing process, as well as just the philosophy of coffee brewing and the coffee profession in general. To me, the idea of tasting things for yourself and getting curious and questioning things as a professional, like we were talking about here towards the end of the conversation, is something that I just love about Pete's approach to coffee in general. This book is one man following ideas to their conclusion through curiosity and the rigor of testing, just following that idea of questioning and coming up with tests and finding evidence for solutions to problems that we all have. We wouldn't have this book if Pete was not curious, if he didn't test things out, and if he didn't question things. Now think about if you did that and I did that more in our careers. Certainly the landscape of specialty coffee would change, not just for brewing coffee, but we have a lot of things in coffee going on right now. Coffee price crisis going on, just the environmental factors impacting coffee and the farm level, down to the environments in which people work creating coffee in the store. There's no shortage of problems in coffee that could benefit from this approach. And I'm thankful that we can have a few less problems in coffee because of Pete's book. Now, if you want to get this book, which I don't know why you would not want to get this book, I highly encourage you to do so. Not just for you, but you should probably get this for your staff as well. You can go to licatacoffeeconsultants.com. You can purchase the ebook, How to Get the Best from Your Coffee. Of course, a print book is in the works at some point. Right now, this is a really easy-to-use format in an ebook. So, licatacoffeeconsultants.com. And I want to say thank you so much to Pete for joining us on the show, coming back and teaching us some more things about coffee, about how to approach coffee. I just want to say that I've known Pete basically since the early 2000s, and competed alongside of him, and got to be witness to his career development. And I guarantee you it's not really hyperbolic of me to say that he is one of the most humble, earnest, and hardworking professionals you could ever meet in this industry, or probably anywhere. And I think it shows in this book. And again, go out, get it. licatacoffeeconsultants.com is a place to go do that. Now, some keys to the shop news here. Coffee Fest Los Angeles. This is happening August 25th through the 27th, and you need to go to this if you're in the area. It's going to be a fantastic show. I'll be there as a latte art judge as well as a presenter of several different seminars. I would encourage you to attend. If you see me, I would really love to meet you there. I've been going to Coffee Fest for over 40 shows, and I can tell you absolutely that these shows are just getting better and better. The content is amazing. The tracks for learning are second to none. I absolutely think that if you're in coffee retail, This is the best conference or trade show that you could go to, hands down. Go to coffeefest.com, click on the Los Angeles tab, get registered, look for different educational tracks that apply to your situation, and you will not be sorry. And of course, it's Los Angeles, so it's an amazing environment, and it's nice and warm. There's lots of coffee, and hopefully I'll see you there. Of course, if you want to get in contact with me for any reason, you can just email me, chris@keystotheshop.com. I always love hearing from listeners of Keys to the Shop. And I want to mention also thank you to all of you who have left ratings or reviews for the show. We're up to 82 reviews, which I find really flabbergasting. I think that's so many, and I'm so blessed to be able to do this show. And I'm thankful for all of you listening. It's been such an honor to create a show that helps you in your career and in your business. And there's just more great stuff to come. So thank you again. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.